In the heart of the ancient world rose an empire of unparalleled might. Rome. Its legions were unmatched, its engineering genius legendary, its influence stretching from the sands of Africa to the forests of Britannia. Yet beneath this veneer of power and civilization pulsed a dark, brutal truth. The very foundation of the Roman Republic was built upon the backs of millions of enslaved people. They toiled in mines, worked vast estates, and fought to the death in arenas for Roman amusement. Their lives were cheap, their wills broken, their fate sealed by the decree of their masters. But what happens when the voiceless find a voice? When the broken rise up? How could a ragtag band of the most subjugated, led by a single gladiator, ignite a firestorm that would engulf the most powerful empire of its age? This is the extraordinary saga of Spartacus, a Thracian warrior condemned to fight for Roman sport, who dared to dream of freedom. Over 2 tumultuous years, from 73 to 71 BC, Spartacus and his ever-growing army of escaped slaves and dispossessed souls would sweep across the Italian peninsula, shattering Roman legions, seizing towns, and sending shockwaves through the very heart of the Republic. This wasn't merely a rebellion. It was an existential crisis, a fundamental challenge to the Roman way of life. Join us as we journey into the heart of this epic struggle, exploring the strategies, the sacrifices, the triumphs, and the ultimate tragedy of a revolt that defied all odds and forever etched the name Spartacus into the annals of history. We will delve into 30 pivotal moments, examining the meticulous planning, the desperate battles, and the profound human spirit that yearned for liberty against overwhelming power. In the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic stood as an unparalleled colossus, a beacon of civilization, law, and engineering marvels. Its legions had carved an empire that stretched from the sun-drenched shores of Africa to the cold forests of Britannia, commanding vast wealth and power. Grand temples pierced the sky, bustling forums hummed with political intrigue, and magnificent aqueducts channeled life-giving water to millions. This was a society of unprecedented sophistication, a titan whose very shadow seemed to engulf the known world. Yet beneath this glittering veneer of grandeur lay a dark, brutal truth. The very foundation of Rome's might, its economic engine, its lavish lifestyle, was built on the backs of millions of enslaved people. Estimates suggest that up to 1/3 of the population of Italy alone were slaves, a staggering number that speaks to the sheer scale of this human tragedy. They were the silent workforce, the forgotten architects of Rome's prosperity. Enslaved through conquest, debt, or birth, these individuals were mere property, tools in the hands of their masters. Their lives were a brutal, unending cycle of toil. In the vast agricultural estates of the South, they toiled under the merciless sun, chained together, driven by the whip of an overseer, their bodies broken by grueling labor in the fields. In the suffocating depths of mines, they chipped away at the earth for precious metals, their lungs filling with dust, their futures as bleak as the tunnels they excavated. In Roman homes, they served every whim, from the most mundane chores to the intimate care of their masters, their dignity stripped away with their freedom. Even the most educated and skilled among them, doctors, teachers, scribes, were still chattel, subject to the arbitrary will of their owners. The systemic cruelty was pervasive, woven into the very fabric of Roman law and culture, a constant, chilling reminder of the value placed on human life when it was not one's own. This immense, subjugated population, perpetually held captive by the iron fist of Roman authority, represented a simmering cauldron of resentment, a vast human engine of suffering waiting for a spark. Within this vast system of Roman slavery, a particularly brutal and captivating subset existed, the gladiators. These men, often prisoners of war or condemned criminals, but sometimes even free volunteers driven by debt or a lust for glory, were bought and sold not for their labor, but for their ability to kill and entertain. Their lives were a paradox, glorified warriors condemned to die for public spectacle. Our story begins in Capua, a city south of Rome, renowned for its gladiatorial schools, or Ludi. Here, in the grim confines of a ludus owned by a man named Lentulus Batiatus, the air was thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and fear. Life inside Batiatus's ludus was a harrowing existence. Days were spent in relentless training, pushing bodies to their breaking point. Under the watchful, unforgiving eyes of Lanisti, former gladiators themselves, recruits were drilled in weapon mastery, combat tactics, and the art of putting on a good show for the crowds. They learned to wield the gladius, the trident, the net, their muscles hardening, their reflexes sharpening with every blow. Discipline was absolute, enforced with unflinching severity. A gladiator's life hung by a thread, not only from the constant threat of death in the arena, but also from the brutal punishments meted out for insubordination or weakness. They were valuable commodities, carefully fed and trained, their bodies honed to peak physical condition. Yet they remained property, stripped of their names, their identities, and their fundamental humanity. They lived under the constant shadow of the amphitheater, knowing that any day could be their last, facing opponents who were equally desperate, equally deadly. The roar of the crowd, the clash of steel, the final, fatal thrust. This was their anticipated destiny. It was a world designed to crush hope, to reduce men to fighting beasts, where the only glimmer of freedom was a swift, honorable death, or the fleeting, intoxicating adoration of a bloodthirsty crowd. It was from this crucible of violence and despair that an extraordinary resistance would soon emerge. Among the mass of desperate men in Batiatus's ludus was one who possessed an undeniable, burning difference. His name was Spartacus. A Thracian by birth, he was not a common criminal or a mere barbarian captured in some skirmish. He was likely a warrior, perhaps a chieftain, from the fierce tribes of the lower Danube region, a man who had known freedom, command, and the visceral thrill of battle on his own terms. Conquered by Rome, enslaved like countless others, he was forced into the degrading life of a gladiator, his formidable combat skills now exploited for the entertainment of his oppressors. But Spartacus was more than just a skilled fighter. He possessed a rare combination of attributes that set him apart, even in a world designed to strip men of their individuality. His intelligence was sharp, his gaze perceptive, seeing beyond the immediate brutality to the systemic injustice that bound them all. He possessed an innate charisma, a quiet magnetism that drew others to him, inspiring trust and loyalty where only fear had reigned. Crucially, he was a strategic thinker, capable of planning and foresight, not merely reacting to circumstances. He understood the Roman mind, their strengths, and their fatal weaknesses. In the squalor and despair of the ludus, where men were broken daily, Spartacus embodied a defiant spirit. He recognized the potential for collective action, seeing past the individual rivalries of the arena to the shared desire for freedom that simmered beneath every gladiator's hardened exterior. He spoke not just of survival, but of liberation. It was this rare blend of martial prowess, intellect, and profound empathy that allowed him to forge disparate, broken men into something more, something dangerous. He was a natural leader, not just of gladiators, but of men, and his presence within those walls would prove to be the most critical error Rome ever allowed. The simmering discontent within Batiatus's ludus reached its boiling point in 73 BCE. For Spartacus and his closest compatriots, the daily grind of training, the constant threat of the arena, and the gnawing injustice had become unbearable. A plan was hatched, a desperate, audacious bid for freedom. They intended to fight their way out, to reclaim their lives. But their conspiracy, like so many desperate ventures, was uncovered. Informers betrayed them, and the Lanisti moved to suppress the nascent rebellion before it could ignite. Yet, even as Roman guards converged, the spirit of defiance refused to be extinguished. A core group of around 70 gladiators, led by Spartacus and his trusted lieutenants, the Gauls Crixus and Enemaus, made their move. Trapped and facing overwhelming odds, They fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. With no proper weapons, they seized what they could: kitchen knives, meat spits, anything that could be wielded in self-defense. It was a chaotic, brutal melee within the tight confines of the ludus. Against trained guards, armed with proper swords and shields, these desperate men, fueled by the fire of newly found hope, carved a path to the armory. There, they seized a small cache of gladiatorial weapons, a few swords, some shields, perhaps a trident or two. Their escape was not clean. It was a bloody scramble, but they broke free from the iron grip of Capua. Bursting out into the streets, a ragged band of gladiators, no longer slaves, but men reborn, they knew they could not remain in the city. The Roman authorities would descend swiftly. Their only hope lay in the wild, untamed land beyond. With the alarm raised and Roman patrols soon to be on their heels, they turned their gaze towards a formidable silhouette on the horizon, the brooding, volcanic peak of Mount Vesuvius. It was a desperate flight into the unknown, a single spark that would soon ignite a wildfire across the heartland of Rome. The escapees, a mere 70-odd gladiators, knew that their initial defiance was just the beginning. To survive, they needed a stronghold, a place where Rome's vast military machine could not easily corner them. Their destination, Mount Vesuvius, seemed an unlikely but brilliant choice. Not yet known for its catastrophic eruption decades later, in 73 BC, Vesuvius was a dormant giant, its rugged slopes cloaked in dense, wild vegetation, its summit a formidable, craggy peak. Upon reaching its heights, Spartacus and his men found a natural fortress. The steep, volcanic terrain provided excellent defensive positions, with limited access points that could be easily guarded. The thick forests offered cover and concealment, a stark contrast to the open fields where Roman legions typically dominated. This was an environment where a small, agile force could evade and ambush, turning the very landscape into an ally. From this vantage point, high above the fertile plains of Campania, they could observe Roman movements, plan their next steps, and most importantly, they could signal their rebellion. News of the gladiators' escape from Capua spread like wildfire among the enslaved populations of the surrounding region. And as word reached the ears of those toiling in the fields, mines, and households, a trickle of desperate souls began to make their way towards the volcano. Runaway slaves, shepherds dispossessed of their land, impoverished rural workers, men, women, and even children all sought refuge and freedom under the banner of the gladiators. Spartacus, with his innate leadership and strategic vision, began to organize this growing multitude. He wasn't just leading gladiators anymore. He was forging a burgeoning army of the dispossessed, transforming a band of desperate fugitives into a formidable force driven by a shared, burning desire for liberty. Mount Vesuvius, once a geological feature, had become a symbol, a beacon of hope for the oppressed, and a growing threat to the mighty Roman Republic. Back in Rome, the news of the gladiator escape from Capua caused little alarm. The mighty Republic, accustomed to crushing rebellions and maintaining absolute control, viewed this slave uprising as little more than a minor bandit problem. These were mere slaves, after all, unorganized, unequipped, and utterly incapable of posing a serious threat to the legions that had conquered the world. It was an act of profound Roman arrogance, an underestimation born of centuries of unchallenged power that would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The task of dealing with this nuisance fell to Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber. A man of senatorial rank, Glaber was a politician, not a military commander of distinction. His assignment was considered a simple matter of policing, a minor administrative task, rather than a full-fledged military campaign. Reflecting Rome's contempt for the rebels, he was not given a legion, nor even a cohort of seasoned soldiers. Instead, he was dispatched with a hastily assembled militia, around 3,000 men, mostly inexperienced recruits, untrained town guards, and local levies. They were armed, but their discipline and combat readiness were questionable at best. Glaber himself exuded an air of complacent superiority, He viewed the slaves as a pathetic, leaderless mob, easily dispersed, their brief rebellion quickly quashed so he could return to the comforts of Rome and his political ambitions. His plan was simple: march to Mount Vesuvius, cut off the rebels' escape, and starve them into submission. He ordered his forces to encamp at the base of the only known accessible path up the volcano, effectively laying siege to the bandits. This casual, dismissive approach, born of ingrained prejudice and a colossal failure to grasp the true nature of the enemy, set the stage for one of the most stunning upsets in Roman military history. Rome had sent a politician to fight a warrior, and it would soon pay a terrible price for its hubris. Praetor Glaber's siege seemed impenetrable. His militia, though inexperienced, had effectively blockaded the single known path leading up Mount Vesuvius, cutting off Spartacus's forces from water and supplies. From his camp at the volcano's base, Glaber confidently believed he had trapped the rebels, sure that hunger and thirst would soon force their surrender. But he had gravely underestimated the ingenuity and desperation of Spartacus and his rapidly growing army of freed slaves. Spartacus, a master of unconventional warfare, saw not an impossible barrier, but an opportunity. He observed that Glaber's forces had only bothered to guard the single accessible path. The other sides of the volcano, composed of sheer, treacherous cliffs, were deemed impassable, left entirely unguarded. This was Rome's blind spot, a weakness born of their conventional military thinking. Spartacus conceived a daring, almost suicidal plan. His men, with their intimate knowledge of the wild terrain and their innate resourcefulness, began to gather the abundant wild vines that grew in profusion on Vesuvius's slopes. With painstaking effort, they wove these vines into strong, durable ropes and ladders. The task was fraught with danger, requiring immense skill and teamwork, but the promise of freedom spurred them on. Under the cloak of darkness, or in the misty pre-dawn hours, the rebels executed their audacious deception. While a small contingent maintained campfires and made enough noise to suggest their continued presence, the main body of Spartacus's forces, including women and children, began their perilous descent. Using their makeshift vine ropes, they rappelled down the unguarded, sheer cliff face of Vesuvius, a feat of incredible courage and coordination. Silently, like shadows, they bypassed Glaber's entire siege. Once at the bottom, they moved with stealth and precision, circumventing the Roman encampment. Then, just as dawn broke, they launched a devastating, utterly unexpected surprise attack on Glaber's complacent, sleeping army. The Roman soldiers, caught completely unawares, panicked. Their confidence shattered, their formation broken. They were routed in a matter of hours, their tactical arrogance turned against them by a gladiator's brilliant mind. The defeat of Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber's forces was more than just a battle won. It was a psychological earthquake. Rome's initial contempt for the slave revolt had been spectacularly shattered. The rout was complete, Glaber himself fleeing in disgrace, leaving behind his entire camp and everything within it. This victory provided Spartacus's burgeoning army with something far more valuable than simply avoiding capture. It provided them with Roman weaponry. Suddenly, the desperate band of gladiators and runaway slaves, who had started with kitchen knives and makeshift tools, found themselves equipped with the very instruments of their oppressors' power. Swords, shields, helmets, even the armor of the fallen Roman soldiers. These were now in the hands of the rebels. The psychological boost was immeasurable. Holding a Roman gladius in one's hand, feeling the weight of a Roman shield, transformed a terrified fugitive into a warrior. It was a tangible symbol of their victory, a clear sign that Rome was not invincible, and that they, the enslaved, could indeed challenge the mighty republic. But the acquisition of weapons was only one part of the transformation. Spartacus, ever the strategist, immediately began to arm and train his growing forces. Former gladiators with their combat experience became instructors, teaching the raw recruits how to wield a sword, how to fight in formation, how to move as a cohesive unit. The ragtag collection of desperate individuals began to coalesce into a disciplined, organized army. The supplies left behind by labor, food, equipment, even tents, provided crucial sustenance and infrastructure for the expanding rebellion. This wasn't just a group of bandits anymore. This was a well-armed, increasingly well-trained force, hardened by their first taste of victory, imbued with a fierce sense of purpose and a growing belief in their charismatic leader. The small spark that had ignited in Capua had, by defeating a Roman praetor, now truly become a raging inferno, threatening to consume everything in its path. Rome was about to learn that it had awakened a sleeping giant. The stunning defeat of Praetor Claudius Glaber and his hasty retreat sent shockwaves through the Roman establishment, but not yet the tremors of true alarm. Rome, in its towering arrogance, still believed this was merely a bandit problem, a localized nuisance to be quashed, not a burgeoning revolution. So, in the winter of 73 BCE, the Senate dispatched another praetor, Publius Varinius. His force, roughly 2,000 men, was larger than Glaber's, comprising regular legionaries and auxiliaries, an attempt to bring more serious might to bear. Yet, it was still fundamentally flawed, built on the same fatal underestimation of Spartacus and his growing army. Varinius, like Glaber before him, sought to corner the rebels, to force a decisive, open battle where Roman discipline would surely prevail. But Spartacus was a master of unconventional warfare, a ghost in the Apennine Mountains. He studied Varinius, observed his predictable movements, and exploited every weakness. Instead of direct confrontation, Spartacus employed a relentless campaign of guerrilla tactics. His men would strike suddenly from the dense forests, raiding Roman supply lines, ambushing isolated detachments, and then vanish back into the wilderness before Varinius could respond. They melted away like mist, leaving behind only chaos and demoralization. Varinius found himself constantly outmaneuvered, his legionaries exhausted by endless, fruitless chases. His camps were subjected to daring night raids, his sentries cut down, his supplies plundered. One audacious maneuver saw Spartacus light a massive chain of campfires across a ridge, tricking Varinius into thinking the rebels were still entrenched, while Spartacus's army silently slipped away under the cover of darkness. The Roman praetor, already frustrated, was further humiliated when Spartacus's forces even managed to steal his personal bodyguard, his horse, and his lictors, the very symbols of his authority. These defeats were not just tactical setbacks. They were profound blows to Roman prestige, broadcast across Italy by the fleeing slaves and emboldened locals. Each Roman stumble fueled the rebels' morale, confirming their leader's genius and solidifying Spartacus's legendary status as a man who could outwit even Rome's most seasoned commanders. Word of Spartacus's audacious victories, of Rome's repeated failures against the gladiator and his band of rebels, spread like wildfire across the fertile plains and rugged hills of Italy. It was a whisper that became a roar, carried by runaway slaves, traveling merchants, and terrified Roman messengers. For generations, the enslaved had endured unspeakable brutality, their lives bought and sold, their spirits crushed under the iron heel of the Republic. Now, a spark had ignited a flame of hope, a revolutionary dream of freedom that swept across the peninsula. From every corner of Italy, thousands upon thousands began to answer the call. Not just gladiators or plantation slaves, but also the forgotten multitude, the desperate farm laborers toiling in the latifundia, the shepherds tending flocks in remote pastures, the domestic servants enduring quiet torment in Roman villas. They were men and women from diverse backgrounds, Gauls, Germans, Thracians, Greeks, Italians, all united by the common bond of oppression and the tantalizing promise of liberation. They shed their chains, abandoned their meager existences, and began the perilous journey to join Spartacus's growing force. What began as a desperate band of gladiators had, in a matter of months, swelled into a massive, diverse army. Their numbers grew exponentially, reaching an estimated 30,000, then 50,000, and perhaps even exceeding 70,000 at its peak. This was no longer a mere rebellion. It was a societal upheaval, a migration of the oppressed seeking sanctuary and purpose under the banner of the Thracian gladiator. Their arrival transformed Spartacus's camp from a ragtag collection of fighters into a vibrant, chaotic, yet powerfully unified community. Each new face brought with it not just another pair of hands, but another story of suffering, another burning desire for vengeance and freedom. The tide had truly turned, and Rome, still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the threat, was about to face not just a slave revolt, but an army forged in the crucible of injustice. The transformation from a small band of desperate gladiators into a massive, multi-ethnic army of the enslaved presented Spartacus with an extraordinary challenge. It was one thing to lead a disciplined fighting unit, quite another to command tens of thousands of individuals, many with no military training, all driven by diverse motives, and some simply seeking plunder. The potential for this burgeoning force to devolve into a destructive, undisciplined mob was immense, a weakness Rome eagerly anticipated and often attributed to barbarian armies. But Spartacus was no ordinary leader. His genius extended beyond the battlefield. He possessed an innate understanding of human nature and the necessity of unity. He recognized that discipline was paramount, not just for fighting, but for survival. He implemented a strict code of conduct, enforcing order and preventing the wanton destruction and indiscriminate violence that could alienate potential allies and squander precious resources. Punishment for infractions was swift and severe, but justice was dispensed fairly, earning him respect and loyalty. He instilled basic military drills and formations, transforming disparate individuals into cohesive fighting units, teaching them how to fight not just with brute strength, but with strategy and coordination. Crucially, Spartacus understood the vital importance of resource management. With an army of this size, provisioning was a constant struggle. He established systems for foraging, ensuring that supplies were gathered efficiently and, perhaps more remarkably, distributed equitably among his diverse followers. He shared the spoils of war, not allowing a few to grow rich while others starved. And in a remarkable display of practical leadership, Spartacus ordered the melting down of precious metals, looted Roman silver and gold, not for personal adornment, but to forge desperately needed weapons and armor. This act epitomized his vision, transforming symbols of Roman wealth and power into instruments of liberation for his people. It was this rigorous discipline, this shared sense of purpose, and this innovative resourcefulness that prevented his army from fragmenting, forging it into a formidable fighting force capable of challenging the very foundations of the Roman Republic. Spartacus, for all his singular genius, was not alone at the helm of this burgeoning revolution. His success was also due, in part, to the formidable lieutenants who commanded significant factions within his diverse army. Foremost among them were Crixus, a powerful Gaul, and Enemaus, a fierce German. Both were former gladiators, seasoned in the brutal amphitheaters of Rome, and had escaped Capua alongside Spartacus. They were men of immense strength and courage, respected by their followers, and crucial to the early victories against Roman forces. Crixus, in particular, led a substantial contingent of Gauls and Germans, fighters known for their ferocity and desire for direct confrontation. Enemaus, too, commanded a loyal following among his Germanic brethren. These commanders brought invaluable warrior spirit and tactical prowess to the rebel cause. However, as the army swelled and their successes mounted, so too did strategic disagreements begin to surface, fault lines appearing within the leadership that would ultimately prove tragic. Spartacus, a strategic visionary, envisioned a grander escape, a path to true freedom beyond the reach of Roman power, perhaps over the Alps and back to their homelands. He understood that engaging in a prolonged war of attrition with Rome, especially within its own heartland, was a losing proposition. Crixus and Enemaus, while brave, were often more impulsive, driven by a desire for immediate vengeance, plunder, and the glory of battle. They saw Italy, especially the rich southern regions, as ripe for the taking. Their followers, many of whom had suffered unspeakable atrocities, yearned for retribution and the spoils of war. The tensions simmered. The long-term, strategic vision of Spartacus against the immediate, visceral desire for plunder and bloody confrontation shared by some of his most powerful lieutenants. This emerging conflict of objectives, freedom versus vengeance, escape versus engagement, became a profound challenge to the unity of the rebel army. While Spartacus maintained overall command, the independent spirit of Crixus and Enemaus and the preferences of their loyal warriors would soon force a fateful decision, one that would irrevocably alter the course of the revolt. By early 72 BCE, the scale of Spartacus's rebellion was undeniable. Rome, at last, was beginning to grasp the severity of the threat, acknowledging that this was no longer a regional disturbance, but a full-blown war on Italian soil. With the humiliation of Verinius still fresh, and the number of rebels growing exponentially, Spartacus made a critical strategic decision. He would lead his massive army south. This move was multifaceted, serving both tactical and logistical needs. Moving through the fertile regions of Campania and then into Lucania, Spartacus's army continued its relentless march. These were some of the richest agricultural lands in Italy, dotted with sprawling Roman villas and vast estates. This southward trajectory allowed the rebels to systematically forage for essential supplies, replenishing their stores of food, grain, and livestock. It was a calculated act of survival, but also a profound symbolic gesture, the enslaved feeding themselves from the very bounty they had helped create for their masters. Local Roman forces, still largely unprepared for an army of this size and ferocity, were swept aside with brutal efficiency. Town after town, villa after villa, fell to the rebels, providing not just sustenance, but also new recruits and valuable resources. Yet, this march south was more than just a search for supplies. It was a deliberate provocation. Each victory, each plundered villa, each Roman defeated on their own land, further eroded Rome's authority and spread fear among the Roman elite. The tales of Spartacus's prowess grew, reaching even the most insulated corners of the Republic. The path of destruction left in the wake of the rebel army was a stark message. The old order was crumbling. But while the immediate gains were substantial, this aggressive advance deeper into Italy also came with a dangerous allure. The temptation of plunder and the strategic disagreements that had begun to fester within the leadership, especially among Crixus's faction, would soon reach a critical juncture. The march south was both a testament to Spartacus's strategic brilliance and a harbinger of the internal strife that threatened to unravel his extraordinary achievement. For too long, Rome had dismissed Spartacus as an aberration, a temporary stain on its formidable power. But by 72 BCE, the scale of the revolt had become undeniable, the reports from the south too alarming to ignore. The repeated defeats of Praetorian armies were not just embarrassing. They were a profound threat to the very stability of the Republic. The Senate, shaken from its complacency, finally recognized the slave revolt for what it truly was, a major war, an existential crisis demanding Rome's utmost attention and military might. In a dramatic escalation, the Senate bypassed its usual practice of dispatching praetors and instead appointed two of its most senior military commanders, the consuls themselves. Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodinus and Lucius Gellius Publicola, the chief magistrates of the Republic, were given legions and entrusted with the monumental task of crushing the rebellion. This was an extraordinary commitment of resources, signaling Rome's unshakable resolve. Each consul was assigned 2 legions, creating 2 independent armies, each comprising approximately 10,000 men. These were not the hastily assembled forces of Glaber or Verinius. These were hardened, professional Roman legions, battle-tested and rigorously trained. The strategy was clear. Lentulus would advance through the Apennines to intercept Spartacus from the west, while Gellius would move along the Adriatic coast, aiming to trap the rebels in a pincer movement. The might of the Republic was finally being unleashed, its immense resources mobilized to deal with an internal enemy unprecedented in its audacity. The stakes were monumental. For Rome, failure was inconceivable. Its prestige, its economic stability, and its very social order depended on the swift and brutal eradication of this slave army. For Spartacus and his followers, the arrival of consular armies heralded the true beginning of their struggle against overwhelming odds. The fight for freedom, which had begun with such surprising success, was about to enter its most perilous and defining chapter. The arrival of Rome's consular armies marked a turning point, intensifying the simmering disagreements within the rebel leadership. Spartacus still envisioned a path to freedom, a strategic retreat over the Alps to allow his people to escape Roman dominion. But for Crixus and many of his Gaulish and Germanic followers, the lure of plunder and the satisfaction of direct, bloody vengeance proved irresistible. The long march south, the taste of victory, and the abundant spoils had solidified their desire for confrontation, not escape. Near Mount Garganus in Apulia, the fatal division occurred. Crixus, with a contingent estimated at around 30,000 men, mostly Gauls and Germans, broke away from Spartacus's main army. His reasons were complex, perhaps a belief that their numbers were now sufficient to defeat Rome in open battle, a yearning for more immediate retribution, or simply an inability to accept Spartacus's cautious, long-term strategy. He chose to remain in Lucania and Apulia, intent on continuing the systematic plundering of the wealthy Roman countryside, a decision fueled by a potent mix of pride, greed, and a thirst for battle. This decision proved catastrophic. Lucius Gellius Publicola, commanding one of the consular armies, wasted no time. He moved swiftly to engage Crixus's separated force. The ensuing battle near Mount Garganus was a brutal, hard-fought affair. Crixus and his men fought with their characteristic ferocity, but they lacked Spartacus's strategic genius and the disciplined cohesion of the main rebel army. Gellius's professional legions, fresh and well-supplied, executed their tactics with Roman precision. Despite their bravery, Crixus's contingent was overwhelmed. The battle culminated in a crushing defeat for the rebels, with Crixus himself falling in combat, dying as he had lived, sword in hand, defiant to the last. Thousands of his followers were slaughtered, their bodies left to rot on the battlefield. Crixus's last stand was a tragic testament to the divisions that plagued the rebellion, a stark reminder of the immense price of disunity against a relentless enemy. News of Crixus's death and the annihilation of his force reached Spartacus like a thunderclap. Despite their strategic disagreements, Crixus was a fellow gladiator, a brother in arms who had fought beside him from the very first escape at Capua. His death was a personal blow, igniting in Spartacus a profound grief mixed with burning fury and an unyielding desire for vengeance. This was more than just a tactical loss. It was a deeply emotional wound, transforming Spartacus's resolve into a terrifying, focused wrath. In a chilling act of defiant remembrance, Spartacus orchestrated a spectacle worthy of the amphitheaters for which they had escaped. He gathered 400 captured Roman soldiers, men who had served in the consular armies, and forced them to fight to the death as gladiators. It was a brutal, symbolic inversion of Roman cruelty, a grim tribute to Crixus, designed to send a clear message. Rome's own barbaric practices would now be turned against them. The sight of Roman citizens, soldiers even, butchering each other for the entertainment of former slaves was a moment of profound psychological warfare, a stark inversion of the power dynamic. But Spartacus's vengeance was not merely symbolic. His strategic brilliance, sharpened by grief and rage, became truly devastating. He first turned his attention to Lentulus Clodinus, the other consul. With a series of masterful maneuvers, Spartacus outflanked and decimated Lentulus's army, inflicting a crushing defeat and capturing their standards and supplies. Then, without pause, he wheeled his forces to confront Gellius Publicola, the very man responsible for Crixus's demise. In a subsequent, equally decisive engagement, Spartacus's unified, highly motivated army utterly routed Gellius's legions. The consular armies, Rome's elite, had been sent to crush the rebellion, but instead, they themselves were humiliated and shattered. Spartacus, fueled by the memory of his fallen comrade, had not only avenged Crixus, but had once again demonstrated his unparalleled tactical superiority, reminding Rome that even their mightiest legions were no match for a gladiator leading an army of the wronged. With the taste of victory still fresh, a remarkable decision was made. Instead of reveling in their newfound dominance over two consular armies, Spartacus, the gladiator who had become a general, turned his eyes northward. His aim was not simply to defeat Rome, but to lead his people, this diverse, desperate army of slaves, gladiators, and dispossessed, out of Italy entirely. Their destination, Cisalpine Gaul, a gateway to the majestic, imposing peaks of the Alps. This wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a strategic march towards liberation. For many, especially the Gauls and Germans who formed a significant portion of his fighting force, passing through the Alps meant a chance to finally disperse, to return to their homelands, to fade into anonymity and reclaim lives stripped away by Roman conquest. The prospect was intoxicating. Imagine the whispered conversations around campfires, the shared dreams of family, of soil that was truly their own. After years, perhaps decades, of brutal servitude, the horizon offered more than just another battle. It offered a glimpse of genuine freedom. Spartacus understood this profound yearning. His leadership wasn't just about military might. It was about embodying this hope, sustaining the fragile belief that a world beyond Rome's grasp was possible. Their march was grueling but purposeful. Every step north, past familiar Roman towns, now looking like distant threats rather than inescapable prisons, was a testament to their resilience. The victories against Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus had proven their fighting spirit, but this journey tested their endurance, their unity, and their faith in their leader. The sheer scale of the undertaking, an entire population on the move, not just an army, speaks volumes. They carried their wounded, their elderly, their children, a testament to the comprehensive nature of their escape. The Alps, shrouded in mist and legend, became more than a geographical barrier. They were a symbolic wall between the horrors of their past and the promise of an uncertain, but undeniably free, future. Hope, a dangerous and potent force, fueled every weary footstep. The path to the Alps was not unchallenged. As Spartacus's forces pressed northward, they encountered another Roman army, led by the proconsul Gaius Cassius Longinus, near the town of Mutina, in Cisalpine Gaul. Once again, the rebel army, disciplined and battle-hardened, proved superior. In a decisive engagement, Spartacus delivered another crushing blow to Roman authority, scattering Longinus's legions and reaffirming the rebels' military prowess. The road was now definitively open. The mountain passes beckoned, the gateway to freedom unobstructed. Yet, in one of the most puzzling and debated decisions of the entire revolt, Spartacus's army did not cross the Alps. Instead, they turned south, back into Italy. Historians have grappled with this pivotal moment for centuries. Why? When the prize of freedom was within their grasp, did they choose to re-enter the very heart of the empire they so desperately sought to escape? Was it internal division? Accounts suggest that a significant portion of his army, perhaps emboldened by their victories, or simply unwilling to abandon the perceived riches of Italy, refused to leave. Did they dream of conquering Rome itself, or at least carving out a permanent sanctuary within its borders? Another theory posits that Spartacus himself, perhaps seeing the logistical nightmare of dispersing such a vast and diverse force across unfamiliar lands, believed their best chance lay elsewhere. Or perhaps, and most tragically, he understood that Rome would never truly allow such a massive affront to its authority to simply vanish. Perhaps he knew that crossing the Alps would only delay the inevitable, drawing Rome's relentless vengeance to their scattered groups. The decision at Mutina remains shrouded in speculation, a ghost in the annals of history. But what is undeniable is that this choice irrevocably altered the course of the war. The dream of individual freedom, once so tangible, morphed into a different, darker struggle. The road to the Alps, once a beacon of hope, became the northern turning point, a crossroads of destiny that led the rebels inexorably towards a far more desperate fate. The decision to turn south from Mutina proved to be a catastrophic pivot, sealing the fate of the revolt. Instead of escaping the clutches of Rome, Spartacus's army, now seemingly aimless in its grand strategy, began a long, arduous march back into the peninsula. This wasn't the triumphant procession of earlier campaigns, but a retreat that felt more like a slow, inexorable descent. Each mile traveled south was a step closer to the inevitable, a prolonged dance with doom. The vastness of Italy, once a hunting ground for Roman legions, now felt like a cage for the rebels. Their likely objective, though never explicitly confirmed by ancient texts, was Sicily. The island held a particular allure. It had been the site of two major slave revolts in the past, the First and Second Servile Wars, proving it fertile ground for rebellion against Rome. Perhaps Spartacus hoped to establish a secure base there, to reignite the flames of freedom on an island that had already known such struggles, and perhaps even to launch a new, more strategic challenge against the Republic. But the journey itself was fraught with peril. They traversed familiar territory, but now the psychological weight of their choice hung heavy. The initial fervor and unity began to fray. Dissensions, always simmering beneath the surface of such a diverse army, started to become more pronounced. Every day that passed with them remaining within Italy's borders was another day for Rome to regroup, to reassess, and to unleash its full, unyielding might. The southward movement, far from providing sanctuary, merely extended their exposure. It gave the Republic the time it desperately needed to overcome its earlier embarrassments and to marshal a response far more potent and ruthless than anything Spartacus had yet faced. The dream of freedom, once almost within reach at the Alps, was replaced by a grim determination to survive, to reach a new, elusive haven. But the clock was ticking, and with every step south, the net of Roman vengeance tightened around them. Rome's initial response to Spartacus had been a series of humiliating defeats. Consular armies, the pride of the Republic, had been repeatedly bested by a slave army, an unthinkable stain on Roman honor. The Senate, gripped by a mix of fear and indignation, realized that a conventional approach would not suffice. The revolt was no longer a minor insurrection. It was an existential threat, shaking the very foundations of Rome's social and economic order. A new, more formidable hand was needed, one willing to employ unbridled ruthlessness. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's wealthiest citizen, a man whose vast fortune was matched only by his boundless ambition and his reputation for political maneuvering. Crassus was not a celebrated military genius, but he was shrewd, utterly pragmatic, and possessed an unwavering determination to succeed, no matter the cost. Seeing an unparalleled opportunity to advance his own political career and solidify his standing in the Republic, Crassus eagerly stepped forward. The Senate, desperate for a solution, granted him extraordinary powers, virtually absolute authority to quell the uprising. This was not a command given lightly. It reflected the gravity of the situation and the depth of Rome's fear. Crassus understood the nature of the enemy, a highly motivated, battle-tested force led by a brilliant tactician. He knew that conventional tactics, which had failed his predecessors, would be insufficient. He would need to rebuild Rome's shattered confidence, instill iron discipline, and prosecute a war of attrition with unparalleled ferocity. His appointment marked a terrifying turning point for Spartacus and his rebels. The initial, somewhat disorganized Roman responses were over. Now, they faced the full, calculated might of a desperate republic, personified by a man driven by ambition and utterly devoid of mercy. Crassus was not fighting for honor or glory in the traditional sense. He was fighting to restore order, to reassert Rome's absolute dominance, and in doing so, to secure his own legacy. This was Rome's ruthless answer. It would bring a new, brutal chapter to the war. Crassus knew that before he could confront Spartacus's formidable army, he first had to conquer the fear and insubordination within his own ranks. The repeated defeats had not only demoralized Roman soldiers, but had also bred a dangerous culture of cowardice. To restore discipline and instill absolute terror, Crassus revived one of Rome's most ancient and horrifying punishments, decimation. This wasn't mere flogging or public humiliation. Decimation was a death sentence, randomly dealt. If a cohort, roughly 480 men, was deemed to have acted with cowardice or failed in its duty, 1 in every 10 soldiers would be chosen by lot. The 9 survivors would then be forced to execute their unlucky comrade, often by bludgeoning or stoning. Imagine the sheer psychological impact. Brothers in arms forced to commit an atrocity against their own, not by an enemy, but by their own commander. It was a calculated, brutal spectacle designed to send an unambiguous message. Disobedience or cowardice would be met with an agonizing, arbitrary death, not by Spartacus, but by Rome itself. Crassus reportedly decimated several cohorts in his early campaign, sending a shockwave of terror and obedience through his legions. The soldiers, no longer fearing Spartacus more than their own general, fought with a renewed, desperate courage. They became steel-hardened not just against the enemy, but against their own instinct for self-preservation. This chilling act was a clear indicator of Crassus's leadership style: uncompromising, ruthless, and ultimately effective. It transformed a broken, fearful army into a disciplined, unyielding machine, ready to face the rebels with a chilling new resolve. The cost was immense in human terms, but for Crassus, the restoration of Roman military honor was paramount. He had forged his legions into a weapon, and now he was ready to wield it against Spartacus. With his legions brutally disciplined and their morale restored, Crassus unleashed a relentless, methodical campaign against Spartacus. No longer would Roman armies be outmaneuvered or surprised. Crassus adopted a strategy of persistent pursuit and strategic encirclement, a grinding war of attrition designed to exhaust and corner the rebels. He shadowed Spartacus's army as they moved through the rugged terrain of Lucania and Calabria, never giving them a moment's rest, never allowing them to regain their footing. Crassus's tactics were mercilessly effective. He dispatched flying columns to harass the rebels' flanks, cut off their foraging parties, and disrupt their supply lines. Food became scarce. Water, always a precious commodity, was increasingly difficult to secure. The once victorious rebel army, now burdened by their southward retreat and constant Roman pressure, began to falter. The strain of incessant marching, the lack of provisions, and the constant threat of a Roman attack wore down their spirit and their bodies. Every skirmish, every lost foraging party, chipped away at their numbers and their hope. Step by agonizing step, Crassus herded Spartacus's forces further south, towards the narrowest point of the Italian peninsula. The land itself became an accomplice to Rome's strategy. The rebels found themselves increasingly hemmed in by the Ionian Sea to the east and the Tyrrhenian Sea to the west, with Crassus's legions forming an impenetrable wall to their north. The strategic brilliance of Crassus's plan became terrifyingly apparent. He was corralling the entire rebel army, forcing them into a geographical cul-de-sac. The Strait of Messina, shimmering in the distance, became not a gateway to escape, but a watery barrier. Spartacus, once a master of maneuver and surprise, was now caught in a relentless vice, trapped at the toe of Italy, with the sea at his back and Rome's most ruthless general closing in for the kill. Trapped at the very tip of Italy, with the formidable legions of Crassus pressing in from the north and the vast, unyielding sea to their south, Spartacus faced a desperate dilemma. His options were dwindling, his army exhausted and cornered. It was here, at the Strait of Messina, that he made a desperate gamble to cross to Sicily. The island, visible across the shimmering waters, represented more than just a piece of land. It was a beacon of desperate hope, a historical sanctuary for slave revolts. Sicily's history was steeped in rebellion. It had witnessed the First and Second Servile Wars, massive slave uprisings that had shaken Rome to its core in the preceding century. For Spartacus, it offered a chance to regroup, to find new recruits among the island's vast slave population, and perhaps to establish a secure, defensible base from which to reignite the broader struggle for freedom. The thought of once again inspiring a people to rise against their oppressors, away from the immediate pressure of the Roman mainland, must have been a powerful motivator. But how to cross? His army, massive and diverse, had no ships. In a move born of sheer desperation, Spartacus turned to the notorious Cilician pirates. These maritime raiders, masters of the Mediterranean, were known for their ruthless efficiency and their willingness to work for anyone who paid. Negotiations began, a clandestine meeting under the cloak of night, promises made, a hefty payment offered in exchange for transport across the strait. For Spartacus, this was his last, best hope. A chance to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, to prolong the dream of freedom for his people, to turn the tide one last time. The rebels, huddled on the shore, looked out at the distant shores of Sicily, their eyes filled with a fragile, almost impossible hope that deliverance was finally at hand. The flicker of hope that had sustained Spartacus and his exhausted army at the Strait of Messina was brutally extinguished. The deal with the Cilician pirates, their last desperate gamble for escape, proved to be a cruel illusion. The pirates, true to their nature as opportunistic brigands, accepted Spartacus's payment, a king's ransom, likely precious spoils taken from Roman villas, but never delivered on their promise. Under the cover of darkness, perhaps in the dead of night, they simply vanished, their ships sailing away into the inky blackness, leaving the rebel army stranded and utterly exposed. Imagine the dawning realization, the gut-wrenching despair that swept through the rebel camp. The empty horizon, the absence of any approaching sails, the cold, hard truth that they had been betrayed. Their last viable escape route was gone. The dream of Sicily, of a new beginning, shattered into 1,000 pieces. They were trapped, truly trapped, at the very tip of Italy, with the vast, unforgiving sea behind them and the relentless, disciplined legions of Marcus Licinius Crassus advancing towards them from the north. The betrayal was more than a tactical setback. It was a devastating blow to morale. This was not a defeat in battle, but a gutting loss of faith, a cruel trick of fate. Spartacus, the man who had defied Rome for years, was now without options, his army exhausted, disheartened, and cornered. The once mighty force that had humbled consular armies was reduced to a desperate, besieged throng. Crassus's strategic encirclement was complete, not by his direct action alone, but by the perfidy of men Spartacus had hoped would be his salvation. The stage was set for the final, bloody act of the revolt. With no escape, no ships, and no hope of further maneuver, Spartacus and his rebels were left to face the full, unbridled fury of Rome, now personified by the ruthless general closing in for the kill. As winter approached in 72 BCE, the legendary gladiator general Spartacus found his path blocked, his revolutionary army cornered. After their tactical retreat into the toe of Italy, the rugged, marshy lands of Bruttium, they believed they had found a temporary sanctuary. But Crassus, the richest man in Rome, was not merely a general. He was an engineer of unparalleled ruthlessness. He understood that to defeat Spartacus, he needed to break not just their bodies, but their spirit, to utterly extinguish the flame of rebellion. His strategy was as audacious as it was brutal. Construct an impassable barrier across the entire neck of the Bruttium Peninsula. Crassus ordered the building of a colossal fortified wall and ditch, stretching for miles, from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Ionian Sea. This was no mere defensive line. It was a cage, a monolithic testament to Roman will. Thousands of legionaries, overseen by expert Roman engineers, toiled relentlessly, carving out a ditch up to 15 feet wide and as many deep, then raising an immense rampart fortified with watchtowers and palisades behind it. Every day, the gap between the seas narrowed, the iron grip of Rome tightening around the trapped rebels. The objective was clear: to completely seal off Spartacus's army. No escape, no forage, no supplies. The wall wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a psychological weapon designed to starve the rebels into submission, to watch them wither away, exposed to the elements and the gnawing certainty of their inevitable doom. Imagine the despair as the last sections of the wall closed, the sound of Roman hammers echoing in the chilling winter air, sealing off their last hope of freedom. For the thousands of slaves, women, and children within Spartacus's ranks, the formidable Roman legions outside the wall were one threat, but the wall itself, and the slow, agonizing starvation it promised, was another, far more insidious terror. Crassus had built the ultimate trap, a monument to Roman ingenuity and its chilling capacity for methodical extermination. And Spartacus, the man who had defied Rome for so long, was caught squarely within it. Trapped by Crassus's insurmountable wall, with winter's icy breath chilling them to the bone, Spartacus's army faced an agonizing choice: surrender and face unimaginable horrors, or attempt the impossible. Starvation was already gnawing at their ranks, and the relentless Roman patrols ensured there was no way out, no chink in Crassus's meticulously crafted armor. But Spartacus was no ordinary commander, and his army was no ordinary foe. Driven by a primal will to survive, he devised a plan as desperate as their situation, a testament to his tactical brilliance and their unyielding spirit. Under the cover of a brutal winter night, a night so dark and frigid it seemed the very gods had turned their backs on the world, Spartacus launched his desperate gamble. His forces, fueled by a mixture of terror and resolve, began the arduous task of filling portions of Crassus's ditch. They used anything and everything at hand: felled trees, brushwood, earth torn from the frozen ground, and tragically, the bodies of their fallen comrades. Every piece of debris was precious, every shovel of dirt a defiant act. The sounds of their struggle were muffled by the howling wind and the falling snow, yet the sheer scale of the effort was immense. Inch by painful inch, they created makeshift bridges across the chasm. Then, with a ferocity born of desperation, they stormed the rampart. The Roman guards, though vigilant, were caught off guard by the sheer audacity of the assault in such unforgiving conditions. A fierce, brutal battle erupted in the darkness, a cacophony of steel, shouts, and desperate cries. Many rebels perished in the ditch, impaled on Roman stakes, or cut down by legionaries. But their sacrifice was not in vain. At immense cost, a gaping hole was punched through Crassus's seemingly impenetrable defenses. In the frigid pre-dawn hours, Spartacus and a significant portion of his army, though battered and diminished, clawed their way to freedom, leaving behind a trail of blood and sacrifice, and a stunned Crassus, whose perfect trap had been breached. The exhilaration of the breakout was fleeting, a brief reprieve before the storm. Spartacus had escaped Crassus's cunning trap, but he had merely exchanged one desperate situation for another, far more encompassing peril. Even as his exhausted army staggered northwards, trying to put distance between themselves and Crassus's pursuing legions, the political machinations in Rome had already begun to seal their ultimate fate. The Senate, ever fearful of Crassus claiming sole glory, and more importantly, terrified by the sheer scale and longevity of Spartacus's revolt, had dispatched additional, formidable forces. From Hispania, fresh from crushing a rebellion, arrived Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. He was Rome's golden boy, a military prodigy whose reputation preceded him like a thunderclap. His legions were battle-hardened, disciplined, and hungry for further glory. From the east, returning triumphant from his campaigns against Mithridates in Thrace, came Lucius Licinius Lucullus, another seasoned general with a proven track record of decisive victories. These were not minor reinforcements. These were two of Rome's most celebrated and capable commanders, each leading thousands of veteran troops. The arrival of Pompey and Lucullus created an inescapable three-pronged trap. Crassus, though initially furious at the Senate's perceived lack of faith, now saw the opportunity to utterly annihilate the rebel threat. Spartacus, having just sacrificed so much to break free, now found himself surrounded by three massive, coordinated Roman armies converging from different directions. The pincer movement was closing in, relentless, and overwhelming. Any hope of escape, any dream of reaching the Alps and fading into freedom, was shattered. The rebel army, weary from constant fighting, diminished by starvation and the brutal winter breakout, now faced the combined might of an empire determined to crush them absolutely. The odds were no longer stacked against them. They were impossibly, tragically overwhelming. Rome would not be challenged again. The net was tightening. With Pompey's legions already making contact with elements of his army from the north, and Lucullus's forces advancing from the east, Spartacus knew his time was running out. There was no escape, no further ingenious trick to evade the full might of Rome. Cornered once again, but this time with no viable route to freedom, Spartacus faced the most profound decision of his legendary command. He could attempt to flee, only to be relentlessly hunted down and annihilated by the converging Roman armies, or he could choose his own battlefield, his own terms of engagement, and face Crassus in a final, decisive confrontation. He chose defiance. He would make his last stand against Crassus's army, the force that had pursued them relentlessly, the army he had so often outsmarted and humiliated. This was a gamble, a desperate, courageous roll of the dice. Strike Crassus before Pompey and Lucullus could fully join the fray, before the three armies could utterly encircle and overwhelm them. It was a faint hope, but it was a hope nonetheless, an opportunity to snatch victory from the jaws of absolute defeat. On the plains of Bruttium in 71 BCE, Spartacus gathered his remaining forces. His army, a patchwork of former slaves, gladiators, and desperate peasants, was a shadow of its former strength. They were exhausted, famished, and knew the likely outcome. Yet, in their eyes burned a fierce, unyielding determination. They sharpened their crude swords and spears, donned their makeshift armor, and listened as their charismatic leader, Spartacus, delivered what must have been his most poignant and powerful address. He spoke not of victory, perhaps, but of courage, of fighting for every last breath, of dying free rather than living enslaved. This was not just a battle for survival. It was a final, desperate affirmation of their humanity, a last, thunderous roar against the chains of Roman tyranny. The stage was set for a clash that would forever echo through history, a tragic symphony of freedom fighters against an unyielding empire. The final battle was a maelstrom of chaos and carnage. On the plains of Bruttium, Spartacus's desperate gamble against Crassus's legions unfolded with a ferocity born of utter desperation. The rebels, knowing this was their last stand, fought with a suicidal bravery that shocked even the hardened Roman veterans. They may have been outmatched, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered, but their will to fight for freedom was incandescent. Amidst the swirling dust and the clash of steel, one figure stood out, leading from the very front, a whirlwind of defiance, Spartacus himself. Eyewitness accounts, though scarce and often biased, describe Spartacus fighting with the fury of a cornered lion. He cut down Roman centurions, broke through their ranks, always pushing, always striving towards one singular, audacious goal, to find and kill Crassus himself. If he could strike down the Roman commander, perhaps, just perhaps, it could turn the tide, or at least deny Rome its ultimate, clean victory. He wounded 2 centurions, killed others, exhibiting gladiatorial skill married with strategic intent. But the Roman lines were too deep, their numbers too vast. The historical record becomes frustratingly vague at this critical juncture. Most ancient historians agree that Spartacus fell fighting heroically, succumbing to numerous wounds from Roman soldiers. His body, however, was never recovered. In the aftermath of the battle, amidst the thousands of fallen rebels and Romans, the body of the legendary gladiator could not be identified, or perhaps was purposefully hidden by his loyal followers to deny the Romans a trophy. This ambiguity only cemented his legend. He did not surrender, he was not captured, and his remains were never paraded through Rome. Instead, Spartacus vanished into the annals of history, a phantom of freedom, a symbol of resistance against overwhelming power. His end was not one of defeat, but of defiant disappearance, transforming him from a man into an enduring myth, the gladiator who dared to challenge an empire. And though he fell, his spirit lived on, unbroken and unchained. With Spartacus and his most loyal followers annihilated on the battlefield, the Roman Republic faced the grim task of dealing with the surviving rebels. The scale of their vengeance would be absolute, designed not just to punish, but to utterly terrify, to send a chilling message that would resonate for centuries. Crassus, determined to solidify his victory and ensure no Roman dared forget the cost of challenging the empire, ordered a horrifying display of Roman power and cruelty. Along the ancient and sacred Appian Way, the very road that led directly into the heart of Rome, Crassus commanded the crucifixion of 6,000 surviving rebels. These were men and women who had fought for their freedom, now condemned to the most agonizing and humiliating death Rome could devise. For miles from Capua, where the revolt had begun, all the way to the gates of the capital, the Appian Way was transformed into a grotesque avenue of suffering. 6,000 wooden crosses, each bearing a dying rebel, stood as macabre sentinels, a silent, yet deafening testament to Rome's unyielding authority. This was no mere execution. It was a ritual of terror, a brutal, miles-long warning to any who might harbor thoughts of rebellion. Travelers approaching Rome would be met with this horrifying spectacle, the stench of death and the sight of contorted bodies serving as a visceral reminder of the consequences of defiance. It was a message etched not in stone, but in flesh and blood, meant to ensure that such a large-scale slave revolt would never happen again. And for nearly 2,000 years, Rome's brutal warning held. There would be no other challenge to its slave system on this scale. The Appian Way, once a symbol of Roman might and engineering, became an eternal monument to the empire's capacity for vengeance, and a stark reminder of the ultimate price paid by those who dared to dream of freedom against the most powerful empire of its time. The rebellion was crushed, but the legacy of Spartacus and the terror of Rome's response would forever haunt the memory of the ancient world. From the dusty confines of a gladiatorial school, a flicker of defiance sparked into an inferno. The journey of Spartacus and his slave army was one of astonishing courage and unyielding resolve. For 2 harrowing years, a band of the dispossessed, armed with little more than desperation and a burning desire for freedom, brought the mighty Roman Republic to its knees. They outmaneuvered seasoned legions, humbled proud consuls, and carved a path of liberation across the very heart of Italy, demonstrating that even the most oppressed can challenge the titans of power. Though their ultimate fate was sealed on the fields of Lucania, the story of Spartacus did not end with his fall. His name, whispered in awe and fear, became a legend. For Rome, the revolt was a chilling reminder of the fragility of its order, prompting reforms and a deeper fear of its enslaved population. For generations to come, and even today, Spartacus endures as a potent symbol, an icon of resistance against tyranny, a champion for the exploited, and an eternal beacon for anyone who dreams of breaking chains. His struggle transcends time, reminding us that the human spirit, even when facing unimaginable odds, possesses an indomitable yearning for liberty, a fierce desire to claim what is inherently ours, freedom.